I'm speaking with Miguel Lavario. He is an associate professor of history at Texas Tech University and was a recent Democratic candidate for the House of Representatives. Welcome to Salon Talks, Miguel.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You have been a historian who has really looked at the history of the border and the militarization of the border. And I guess I just really want to start by asking you why this particular subject interests you.
Well, I'm born and raised from in El Paso, Texas. That's where my family currently still, my extended family, my parents, my brothers, my cousins, the whole nine yards. In fact, I'm heading to El Paso this week and meeting with my family there. So it's a personal endeavor, but it's also been something I've always felt compelled to do professionally and understanding my environment and understanding how it impacts the country as a whole and even globally.
I'm also from El Paso, so I was born and raised there.
Good. So we're both from Chuco.
So I'm sure then, therefore, you've been paying a lot of attention to like what happened this week in El Paso, which is Donald Trump came to the city to sort of raise, I guess, enthusiasm and support for his idea of building a border wall along the border. What are your thoughts, initial impressions on what his speech was like and kind of what you got out of it?
Well, I mean, what I got out of it was I was surprised that he would even go there, considering that after the State of the Union, the El Paso County Sheriff, the El Paso City Mayor, several other public officials came out and gave a rebuttal regarding the inaccuracies and the lies that he told about the impact that the border fencing has had on public safety in El Paso. And El Paso has long been a relatively safe city for at least 30 years. I remember growing up there, I've never felt that El Paso was unsafe like other places in the country, even during the 90s where I was coming of age and we had a narco war during the mid 90s, which was very temporary, but never really dissuaded us from feeling that we were safe in our city or even in Ciudad Juarez. Of course, in Ciudad Juarez, that would change in 2009. But prior to that, we always felt safe. So I think it was very surprising, but then again, not surprising from an individual who really is kind of oblivious to a lot of the truth that's happening and a lot of the facts that are out there. So it was very interesting, and I was very happy to see that you had Beto O'Rourke and several thousand people coming out in support of the city and supporting of the facts that do surround the city.
Yeah, it's kind of surreal, I think, also as a native of El Paso to see the city I grew up in talked about as if it was some kind of crime-ridden zone when it was like, no, we it was normal. We were just kids. We played outside.
Exactly. I mean, it was really kind of it was very surreal in a way. I mean, usually when we're coming from El Paso, we don't usually get about a lot of attention. So anytime that's brought up in a platform like the State of the Union, you're usually kind of excited and happy. But in the way that Donald Trump brought it up, it was very discouraging and very disheartening to see it portrayed in a completely inaccurate light.
So, you studied the history of kind of the militarization of the border, and you mentioned the 80s and the 90s. And back then, there wasn't nearly as much border fencing in El Paso as there is now in other parts of the border. And this has kind of been all built up, a lot of it post 9/11. And I want to hear from you as an expert in all this, what you think of this kind of move towards building fencing at all, and just setting aside Donald Trump's border wall idea.
What I've talked about with other people is that, immigration has long been a political lightning rod, at least for the last 100 years. In fact, I just gave a lecture in my class today and on Monday. The anti-immigrant, the nativist movement that was happening in the 1910s and 1920s is very much a reflection and very much a mirror image of what we're seeing today, the concern of national security, the belief that immigrants are here to do us harm, that they're bringing in disease, that they're going to bring in subversive ideas, that they're here to, really literally blow up the country. We had those same arguments, those same concerns 100 years ago as we're having today. And with that, what I tell people is that unfortunately, our thinking and our ability to discuss these issues hasn't really evolved in over 100 years. What's one of the biggest problems when we talk about these different issues is that we tend to, at least in people that like Donald Trump and those who support his agenda, they want to conflate immigration, border security, and the smuggling of illicit goods as interchangeable and the same problem, and that there's one sort of cure-all policy that we could pass, i.e., a border wall that would cure all those issues. And Donald Trump has mentioned that publicly, that if we just had a wall, we would no longer have crime. We would no longer have a drug problem. He thinks that there's this magic wand. And the problem is that we cannot look at those three issues as one. They are three separate issues. If we want to talk about national security, then we have to look at our airports, our infrastructure. What are we actually trying to achieve when we talk about national security, what that means? As you already know, and many people know, our drugs come in through legal ports of entry. The vast majority of them do. Those who are willing to come in an unauthorized manner come in through airports and through legal ports of entry, and usually overstay visas. And that's where we have an undocumented population. So a wall will not address those particular concerns or issues. And that's where I tell us that we need to have a constructive and real dialogue and discourse, and not use it as a political lightning rod like we have been for the past 100 plus years. And so we need to look at those three different issues of national security, immigration, and the smuggling of illicit goods as three separate issues that require three different solutions. As you know, with immigration, we have such a broken system in that where if you want to get in line and come in through a legal manner, you're looking at anywhere between 15 to 20 years before your status is legalized. So we've learned through history that we have precedent. We have it where we've created, so many obstacles in entering this country legally that only encourages people to go through extra legal means, because quite frankly, it's too expensive, too time consuming, too costly in other ways to go in through a legal manner. It's just better off let's just go around the side and just kind of take our chances, because it's just too burdensome to come in through a legal channel, especially when we know that over 90% of migrants come in to contribute. They certainly don't want to turn the United States into a place that they're leaving. There's a reason why they're putting themselves through this, arduous process and arduous journey and very dangerous journey, is to find safety and to find a place where they can contribute and live out their dreams. It just doesn't make any common sense that somebody would come to the United States to turn it into the place that they're trying to escape.
One thing I've learned a lot in kind of covering this issue and talking to people about this issue is I think a lot of people in the United States don't have much of a sense of what it's like to live on the border. Mm-hmm. They're only vaguely aware that some American cities go up against the border, like San Diego and El Paso. They don't really know what it's like to be there. And I want to ask you what your sense is of what kind of impact it has on the people living in the border area on both sides of the border when we treat the Mexican-American border like it's this sort of danger zone.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you being a native El Paso, and can definitely relate to this, is that growing up in the border, it is very upsetting when you have policymakers that are not from the border passing policies that negatively impact us, because they have this idea or this sense that the border needs to be controlled, that there's some kind of element that needs to be managed down there. And when I grew up there, going to Juarez was not like, ooh, we're going to a different country, or we're going, it was like, no, I'm going across the street. I mean, we all kind of treated it that way. It's like, I need to go to the store, I need to go to the doctor, I need to go see my tia or my abuelo or whomever. It's just like you would go from one part of the city to the other part of the city. We never, ever, at least growing up there, never saw Ciudad Juarez as this, very unique and bizarre place that's across the river. It's just right there, and even in San Diego and other parts of the border where you have to travel, 10 miles, 5 miles to get to the port of entry. And El Paso, our downtowns are connected to Ciudad Juarez. So you're literally steps away from entering the country. So it is disheartening to hear that people don't understand it. And that's why it was really encouraging to hear Will Hurd kind of be the voice of reason, especially as somebody who's from the Republican Party, that is addressing it in a way that understands that, there are factors of a barrier. There are factors of adding more Border Patrol officers on the ground, but also technology, and utilizing that to better secure, to better facilitate how we manage the flow going back and forth. And we have to understand this. Is a lot of people in the interior think that, oh no, we need to close it, like it's going to keep us safe. It's like they don't understand that, no, we need an open border so that goods and people can come back and forth, because our economies, not just Texas or California, but our national economy is dependent on that open border. I always tell people, I always find it odd that, these individuals who want to close our border, they want it closed, but they want open, because they definitely support NAFTA or NAFTA 2.0, as they've been discussing recently, but yet they want to close the borders. Like, you can't have open and close at the same time. And I think that when you have people from the border, and it's kind of typical. I was on a panel not too long ago, and where I asked the Border Patrol chief, I think he was out of the San Antonio district, I said, how many times do you get a policymaker sitting down and talking to you about what is it that you need? What is it that you can assess? What are your ideas or suggestions? He goes, very rarely. They just want to report, and then they take that and they kind of like pick and choose what they want for their own political agenda, and they take off, and they find it very frustrating that they can't be utilized in a manner that can be very constructive in how we manage our borders. So it's certain things like that that I think frustrate a lot of us that are from there, or at least familiar with the area, that there is a huge disconnect between those not from the border or familiar with the border and those who are making policy.
Yeah, one thing that I find very interesting was I talked about people I had known back home who commuted from Juarez to El Paso for work, or vice versa. And people were genuinely surprised. And I'm like, are you, though? Because in New York, you see people that commute to London for work.
Yeah.
So...
Right. Well, they don't look at Windsor and Detroit. I mean, people up in that area where it's very similar to sense of proximity to El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and you have two major cities, but nobody thinks twice about that. It's like, well, that's just Canada. It's like, Canada's another sovereign country. It's no different than Mexico, but Mexico's this big bad boogeyman that they don't understand that, no, there's people there that like to raise their kids in a safe environment and have dreams and aspirations like everybody else in the United States. And yeah, they find it very odd. And, for us, I went to school with kids who traveled from Juarez every morning and came to my high school and vice versa. And I taught the El Paso Community College for some time. And most of my students were commuting every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning to beat the rush just to come to school. And it was a great experience. And I really enjoyed that. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about being on the border is this bicultural, binational, bilingual environment that we are fortunate to live in. I mean, living out here in Northwest Texas, I miss that. I don't hear Spanish as often as I would like. I go back to El Paso, it's like I'm in a whole other country. We're definitely in a different time zone as the rest of Texas, but it's definitely something I think we should cherish, and that's why I appreciate about people like Beto O'Rourke or others who can say like, no, we're stronger and we're better when we have this kind of diversity and this kind of biculturalism.
So hopefully Donald Trump will not be in office forever or very long at all. He's unfortunately instigated, I think, a situation where we're looking at a rise of white nationalist rhetoric. Fox News nowadays, you're seeing a real rise in kind of the discourse that demonizes immigration just wholesale, just treats immigrants from Africa, immigrants from Latin America as contaminants, frankly, in this country. How do you imagine us moving past this? Because once Donald Trump is out, hopefully I think a lot of people are going to want to put this chapter behind us in American history.
Yeah, I think that, the rhetoric needs to stop. I mean, the demonization, the criminalization of Latinos, specifically those of Mexican descent, it's been going on for over 170 years. I mean, since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. The idea that Mexicans are the enemy of the people, and that's one of the things that I argue in my book, is that we've treated people of Mexican descent as problems, as threats, not as integral and integral parts of our communities and our society, and definitely in building the United States, both infrastructurally but also politically and culturally. So I think we need to stop with the rhetoric. Donald Trump started his campaign demonizing and criminalizing Latinos, and more specifically people of Mexican descent. And he's carried that consistently throughout his presidency so far. So I think that needs to start. And we're seeing it repeated by politicians who support him, that they're using that same language when they, quite frankly, have no clue what it's like, have never set foot in the border, or if they have, it's been for a photo opportunity, and then they're out. It's like Donald Trump flew in, flew out. Did he get a chance to see El Paso? No. And not that, frankly, I don't care if he does or not, but he doesn't understand it. He doesn't want to understand it. And he would see, because it would contradict what he's saying. He'll see a community that is interdependent, and that is really one community between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. So it's I think the rhetoric needs to be put away. It needs to be stopped doing that. Let's start looking at things, like I said earlier, having constructive discourses about what it is that we want to achieve. What's the issue that's at hand? Is it a broken immigration system? Okay, what do we define that? What is that? Is it the fact that we're keeping people on the hook for too long? Okay, then how do we resolve that? Is it, where do we turn the 15, 20 year waiting period to at least 5 or 3? Where people will be encouraged to go through the legal channels of seeking a legalized status here in the United States. I think that's one way. And historically, we've proven that. The more obstacles, the higher the rate that we're going to see with unauthorized entries. So we need to, and it doesn't mean negative free-for-all, not vetting people, and that doesn't mean that. What it is making it an efficient process that allows the people who want to contribute to have a more efficient way of retaining legal status here in the United States. So I think that's where we need to move in. That's, hopefully we can go and have a real discourse. We're talking about facts. I mean, I hate to say it like that, because we keep talking about a president who's, I think after El Paso, he reached that 10,000 line mark, I think, in his first 2 years, especially all the stuff he was talking about with El Paso. We can't have any sort of progress if we can't even start on the same foot on actual facts and reality of what we're talking about. I mean, you go down from a personal exchange with a conversation with somebody to professional and to diplomatic. You can't start with just a bunch of lies and say, what are we going with? Then it's just going to be fantastical that what we're talking about. So I think that's where we need to start with.
And I think the last thing I want to ask you is, there's this growing abolish ICE movement in the United States, this idea that interior enforcement of people that have moved here and live here and documented just needs to be drastically reduced, if not ended, outside of people that have committed crimes, right? Mm-hmm. Do you have an opinion on that, or?
I do somewhat. I mean, I think that, ICE is an evolution of what we saw with the Border Patrol being expanded, as they allowed Border Patrol to set up checkpoints within 100 miles of a boundary. I go back to El Paso several times a year, and I have to go through a Border Patrol checkpoint in the middle of nowhere near the Guadalupe Mountains, and we have to go through that. So the ICE is just an expansion of that. But I think it's also an offshoot of what happened in 9/11. But what we're seeing is that we're seeing more instances, rather than effectiveness, of ICE being more disruptive, being harassing individuals. I had a international student that came up to me last year during the campaign who said, I don't want you to name me or anything like that, but I just want to tell you, my wife and I were flat out harassed. They made up reasons to enter their home, saying that you don't have your visa, you don't have this or that. So that's absolutely untrue. It's right here. They were showing them, and they repeatedly visited them the same night simply to harass them. They weren't arrested, they weren't taken to questioning, and there was nothing there to suggest that they needed to be questioned. And those are the kinds of stories that we're seeing more and more of, that complicate the validity and the effectiveness of ICE when they're essentially just harassing people. And that's where I think the growing tension is coming from, because we're seeing it that, you're not, the idea that you're actually going and getting people who are here to do us harm is becoming fewer and far between, and you're having more activity with people who are here to contribute and are simply here living here peacefully. So I think that's where the animosity is coming from, that tension is, and I think it's warranted. We saw that with the Border Patrol when they expanded, 80 years ago, or no, actually, I'm sorry, about 60, 70 years ago, when they started going to the interior and going into people's homes and going to people's workplaces. But it took the employers and it took all those to kind of come back, say, don't be doing that. We're going to exercise our private property rights. And plus, you're taking my workers. Who's going to start producing what we need to be done? So there's a lot at stake. And I tell people, immigration is not going to be solved with one wall. with one policy. It's a very complicated issue that there's a lot of hands at stake. There's a lot of hands in the pot that benefit and also are disadvantaged by the system. So it's going to be a long process, but it needs to be done on an honest level.